Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Joseph Glore, your host, and for this week's episode, we are picking up where we left off in last week's episode with Bishop Barron's brilliant talk on faith and Catholic intellect. Bishop has outlined 4 applications of the Christian claim that Christ is the Logos, the defining word by which we understand all reality. We resume here with Bishop explaining the difference between authentic freedom in Christ and bland secular autonomy. This next part is really outstanding, so let's get focused and open our ears to what God might have for us in Part 2 of Bishop Barron at Duke University, beginning now.
Here's a way now of specifying this a little bit. And here I'm relying on the work of a great Dominican scholar called Serve Pincaires. Died just a short time ago, was a professor at Freiburg in Switzerland. Pincaires distinguishes 2 types of freedom. The first he calls the freedom of indifference. The second, freedom for excellence. And everything will hinge upon this distinction. What's the freedom of indifference? The view of freedom that comes up from Scotus and Occam in the late Middle Ages, and then very much informs the modern philosophers I've been describing. Here's the freedom of indifference. Freedom means, liberty means, to stand above the yes and no, indifferent to the two, and on the basis of no compulsion, interior or exterior, to decide. Do I come to Duke to give this talk, or do I stay home? I hover above the yes and no, and then I freely decide, without any compulsion. That's freedom. It's autonomous self-direction. Now again, think of the moderns, including Thomas Jefferson, and the people that inspired our culture, are very strong precisely on this autonomous sense of freedom. Now, on that reading, what's the threat to freedom? Anything heteronymous. Now again, think of Kant here. Anything heteronymous. Other people, societies, churches, laws, ultimately, God, the supreme threat to my capacity to determine the meaning of my life. Did you ever read the 1992 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in the matter of Casey versus Planned Parenthood? It was an abortion-related case, but what's really breathtaking is the way the justices expressed their judgment. Here's part of it. It belongs to the very nature of liberty to determine the meaning of one's own life, of nature, of the universe, and of existence. Oh, is that all? That's all I get to decide. You see how breathtaking that is? It's this, if you want, freedom of indifference run amok. Now, Pincaires contrasts that to another view of freedom, which is on display not only in the classical medieval philosophers, but also very much in the Bible. This he calls freedom for excellence. Here's what he means. On this reading, freedom is not primarily autonomy. Freedom is rather a disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. I'll say that formula again, then I'll give you examples. True freedom, freedom for excellence, is the disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. So, I stand before you now as a relatively free speaker of English. I can say pretty much whatever I want to say in English. When I was studying French many years ago, when I was over in Paris and trying to learn the language, and anyone that's wrestled with a second or third language knows what I'm talking about, what I felt above all was unfree. I'm in a seminar room in Paris with all sorts of, smart, articulate francophones, and there I was, knowing what I wanted to say with all the proper nuances, but I couldn't say it, right? I was shackled by my incapacity to speak French. Over time, after submitting to a whole set of disciplines and laws, grammar, syntax, vocabulary, the correction of speakers, etc., I became freer in my speaking. On this reading, freedom is not opposed to law. See how I'm driving at? But rather, freedom is a consequence of law. Law which disciplines the desire so as to achieve the good and then make it effortless. Think of someone that plays a musical instrument. We all know that if we struggle to play the piano or guitar or something. In the beginning, you're unfree. But then, it's not by autonomous choice that you become free. It's by submitting yourself to a whole set of disciplines, practices, examples, correction, etc., that you become free. Any golfers? This is golf country out here, right? I'm a golfer and a very poor one, I would say. What clearly doesn't work when it comes to golf? Take the club and swing any way you want. Just get out there and be yourself. Well, I can guarantee you'll be a lousy golfer. In fact, I have it with me on this trip. Whenever I travel, my favorite magazine is Golf Digest. If you know Golf Digest, it has stories about, golfers and so on. But at the heart of it is a little section that has all these illustrations and instructions of how to stand and your head and your elbow and shoulder and the turn. And I'll find myself reading this magazine mulling over the law. Because the law there is placing in my body and my mind what makes me free to play the game. Who's the freest golfer? Not anymore, he's got the yips, I think, but Tiger Woods at the height of his powers was the freest golfer ever to play. Hit drives, sure, hit a 3-wood, hit out of fairway bunkers, hit out of greenside bunkers, putt, chip, pitch. He could do it all. Now why? Because he just swung the club any way he wanted? No, because his freedom, his desire had become disciplined by a whole set of laws that made the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. Now, can I suggest, everybody, the monothelite controversy that insists upon the two wills in Jesus coming together, an infinite freedom and a finite freedom, in a non-competitive way, so that the finite human freedom of Jesus is, like the burning bush, enhanced and brought to perfection precisely by contact with infinite freedom. That doesn't make any sense on the first reading of freedom, does it? If freedom means autonomy, I decide. But it makes eminent sense on the second reading of freedom. Think here of Paul. Paul, who introduces himself often in his letters as the doulos Christou Jesu. I'm the slave of Christ Jesus. But then Paul can say, that same Paul can say, it's for freedom that Christ has set me free. Well, that makes no sense on the first reading of freedom. If you're anybody's slave, you're not free. On the second reading, it makes perfect sense. The more you're enslaved to Christ, the freer you are. You see now why I'm speaking of a radical humanism. Deus fit homo, ut homo fieret Deus. God became one of us that we might become God. In the icon of Jesus, the Word made flesh, we see who God is, yes. We also see who we are meant to be. We see humanity at its full flourishing. We see, if you want, the burning bush. That's why I never like to give a talk without quoting one of my heroes, St. Irenaeus. 2nd century, very early figure. Practically an apostolic figure because he was taught by Polycarp, who was taught by John. Irenaeus sums up his theology with this famous phrase, Gloria Dei homo vivens. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. Now see, can I suggest that Feuerbach's no to God is the yes to man is the consequence of that teaching having been forgotten. That Christians got very bad at teaching who the true God is. The glory of God is not a humanity that denigrated. The glory of God is precisely a human being fully alive, fully free. Okay. Here's a third application of the icon of Jesus. The idea of creation from nothing. Creatio ex nihilo. If God is not a being, but ipsum esse, right, the sheer act of to be itself, That means that whatever else exists besides God, in its entirety comes from God. Now again, contrast this to a lot of views in the ancient world, ancient philosophy and mythology, whereby God or the gods make the world, but out of something. Right? There's some co-primordial matter or energy or something, and the gods or God shape it into the form that we see. The way an artist would work with wood or clay or something. Well, that ain't it now in the Christian reading. If God is ipsum esse, He's what it means to be, then whatever else exists comes in every detail, in every aspect of its being, utterly from God. Now, what follows from this? Several really interesting things that determine the way Christians think about the world. First of all, creatio ex nihilo means that the entire universe, in every nook and cranny, is marked by intelligibility. The medievals had a great little, typical of the medievals, very laconic adage. Ens est scibile. Just means being is knowable. Now see, it seems obvious, but the more you think about it, the stranger it is. Every aspect of existence, every nook and cranny of the world, at all dimensions, is marked by intelligibility. Why? Because it has been thought into being by a personal, intelligent God. See, there's no surd, there's no aspect of being outside of the causal, personal, and intelligent influence of God. It's all been made from nothing. And therefore, every bit of it is marked by intelligibility. Now, here's something you see in John Polkinghorne. Do you know his work? He's a high-level particle physicist from Cambridge who in midlife became an Anglican priest and does some of the best writing on religion and science today. Peter Hodgson comes to mind. Nicholas Jockey comes to mind. Albert Einstein himself comes to mind. Joseph Ratzinger himself comes to mind. All these people acknowledge that it's no accident whatsoever that the modern physical sciences emerged precisely out of a Christian theological matrix. How come that's not surprising? Because one of the things you need to get the sciences off the ground is this fundamentally mystical assumption that being is intelligible. Mind you, I'm not talking about intelligent design. That's something total. I'm not talking about that at all. Something much more fundamental, that being in every nook and cranny, I don't care if you're looking at a telescope up in the sky, you're looking at a microscope down at the microscopic level, if you're if you're in the ocean, no matter where you look, you're going to find intelligibility. Where's that mystical intuition come from? If not from this doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. In the beginning was the Word, and everything was made through the Word. Intelligibility is a theological, mystical assumption. One reason why, and there's many others I could give, but one reason why the war between science and religion is such a tragedy and such consummate nonsense. The war, I would say theology is the condition for the possibility of the sciences. Here's a second conclusion from creatio ex nihilo. Nonviolence is metaphysically basic. I was privileged to sit with Stanley Hauerwas, one of my theological heroes, and you know how central he makes nonviolence to his thinking. Well, here's one reason, everybody. An implication of creatio ex nihilo is that nonviolence is ontologically basic. Now, why do I say that? Contrast this doctrine again with a lot of other ancient views. In most of the ancient myths of creation, something like a primordial violence takes place. And from that violence comes order. So it's a battle of the gods. Usually it's a god or set of gods having been conquered and their bodies cut apart, and that's how the universe is made. Or some primordial suppression of a negative force leads to order. You see, even in the ancient philosophies, a more refined version of this, whereby Plato's demiurge, looking at the forms, now shapes recalcitrant matter, or how Aristotle's prime mover shapes prime matter into form, right? There's an interventionist, there's an aggressive quality to the making of order. Then there's creatio ex nihilo. God makes the world from nothing. That means what? That means nothing opposes him, nothing stands athwart him, there's no rival to him, but rather through a sheerly nonviolent, and look in the beautiful symbolic language of the Bible, through a sheerly nonviolent act of speech, God gives rise to the whole of reality. Nonviolence is metaphysically basic. Look at now, I mentioned from the Epic of Gilgamesh and ancient things, all the way to Rambo or Dirty Harry or most of our movies. What do you find? That ancient myth that order comes through violence. If you got a gun, I'll get a bigger gun. You got an army, I'll get a bigger army. And I will impose order, creation, through an act of violence. That's a very old story. Then there's this story. Do you see now why, when the Word became flesh, he spoke to us these very strange words? Someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and give them the other. Someone presses you into service for a mile, go a second mile. Resist not evil. You've been told to love your friends, hate your enemies. I tell you, love your enemies. This is not just a nice guy. This is someone speaking out of this fundamental metaphysical perception that nonviolence is ontologically basic. And when we walk the path of nonviolence, we are in line with this great truth. Gosh, again, how bad we've become, I think, at propagating this idea, we Christians. Here's something from Thomas Aquinas I love. Thomas defined creation this way: Quaedam relatio ad creatorem cum novitate essendi. That means it's a kind of relation to the Creator with freshness of being. I see what's wonderful about that is in classical thought, relation is an accident. Now, Aristotelians know what I mean here. There's a being over there, that wall. Here I am, and we have a relationship. I'm standing, in front of the wall. There you are, here I am, and we have a relationship. Relationship is metaphysically secondary to substances, right? But now think for a second. If God is making the universe every minute ex nihilo, that means there isn't like God and me and now we have a relationship, but rather I am every minute already a relationship. Quaedam relatio ad creatorem. I'm a kind of relationship to the Creator, cum novitate essendi, with freshness of being. God continually giving rise to the world. That's why Thomas Merton, by the way, the great spiritual master, said, contemplative prayer is finding the place in you where you are here and now being created by God. It's right out of this tradition, the nonviolence of creation. Here's a third implication of creatio ex nihilo, and I'm happy to have a Franciscan next to me as I say it. The interconnectedness of all created things. How St. Francis loved that idea, how he celebrated it. But you think for a second, if you follow Merton in contemplative prayer and you find the place in you where you are here and now being created by God, what have you found? You found the place where you are here and now being created by God, and where you are here and now being created by God, and where brother, sun, and sister moon are here and now being created by God. Francis is not just, whistling Dixie there or engaging in nice little poetry. That's good, solid metaphysics to speak of brother, sun, and sister moon. That we are connected to each other by the deepest bonds. That we're a bit like an archipelago, right, that looks separate on the surface, but when you go down deep, you find it's all coming from the same place. That's a Christian vision of the world. How our ethical lives would utterly change if we really believed it, right? If we really took it seriously, how everything would change. That's an implication of creatio ex nihilo. Think of those beautiful rose windows. I fell in love with them when I was in France. Those great circles of light and color. But the idea is that the center is Christ. It's always Christ in the middle. And then wheeling around him are all the different elements of the window. Well, see, that's meant to be the cosmos. That's the world. That at the center is the Creator God. And then everything is connected by spokes to that center. and thereby to each other. That's a picture of the well-ordered cosmos. How fractured our world becomes when we forget this doctrine. Okay. How about a last one? Then I promise I'll bring it to a close. Here's a final feature of the icon of Christ, who's the lens by which we see the nature of reality. We're squinting through that lens to see how things really are. Here's the last bit, what the theologians of the 20th century called the Paschal mystery, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I've been looking a little bit more abstractly at Jesus, but now we'll bring the focus in and look at his life, death, and resurrection. And I'll say just a few simple things about this. What was Jesus about? What was he trying to do? Here's one way to look at it. The Mashiach, if you look in the prophets and the Psalms especially, the Messiah, the new David, the anointed one, had a pretty clear job description. The Mashiach was meant to gather the tribes of Israel. He was meant to cleanse the great temple. He was meant to deal with the enemies of Israel. And then finally he was meant to reign as Lord of the nations. Again, I'm distilling that from the prophets and the Psalms and many other sources. That's what people expected of the Mashiach. How wonderful, how startling that the first Christians call him Yeshua Mashiach, right? Jesus the Anointed One. Jesus Christos in Paul's Greek, Jesus Christ. Yeshua Mashiach, the anointed Jesus. They meant he accomplished those four things. Gathering the tribes. Look at everything I've been talking about. God's non-competitive transcendence, creatio ex nihilo, the rose window, non-violence, that we are meant to co-inhere. See, that's the vision. That's the biblical vision. What's happened is we fell apart through sin, violence, drove us apart from each other. What was God's plan now in the Bible? It was a rescue operation. It was a rescue plan. The means he chose was a people Israel. Israel, in the unity of its praise, learning the mind and heart of God, would now serve a magnetic purpose. They would gather the tribes of the world back to God. Mount Zion, true pole of the earth, the psalmist says. There all the tribes go up, Isaiah says, the tribes of the Lord. See, the idea is Zion, where Israel worshipped, would become the magnetic place where all the tribes of the world would be gathered together like a great rose window. Watch Jesus' ministry now. It's an in-gathering ministry. It's a gathering in. Jesus' open table fellowship. All the contemporary scholars talk about that. Saints and sinners, the insiders, the outsiders, the ups, the downs, everybody welcome at his table. Look at Jesus going out to the woman at the well, to the man born blind, to Zacchaeus, gathering in those who had been sent to the margins. The night before he dies, he gathers on Mount Zion, true pole of the earth, with his 12 disciples, evocative of the 12 tribes, gathering them in. Cleansing the temple. The temple, that's what was on top of Mount Zion. The place of right praise. Do you see how that's the way the rose window comes together? When Israel praises God aright, they become united. And their praise was meant to be so compelling that the whole world will be drawn to it. The trouble is the temple had become corrupt. And so all the prophets call for the cleansing of the temple. Look at Jesus now. In reference to himself, you have a greater than the temple here. His own person now becomes the place of right praise. People come to him to be healed, to have their sins forgiven, to learn how to pray. And that's why at the climax of his life, he goes into the Jerusalem temple. He cleanses it and then pronounces judgment upon it. This place will be torn down, and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. What's he talking about? But the temple, John tells us, of his body. He himself becomes the place of right praise. Dealing with the enemies of Israel, that was the task of the Mashiach. Think of David the warrior, all the great warrior kings of Israel. Is Jesus in that tradition? Yeah, in one sense. But what a strange warrior he is. I have the cross here, right above me. That we put that up here is just deeply weird. Imagine how someone coming from the ancient world in a time machine to this gathering, and here we are, it's a religious talk, and for religious purposes in this sacred room, we have a Roman cross? Are you people out of your minds? That terrified people in the ancient world. The cross was state-sponsored terrorism. It was so horrific that even the greatest orators and poets at the time wouldn't talk about it. We speak of excruciating pain, right? Ex cruce, from the cross. We'll put you on this instrument of torture, we'll leave you there till you die, and then the scavenging animals will pick apart your body. That's what the cross meant. That's where the enemies of Jesus put him. Peter says, the author of life came and you killed him. Extraordinary, isn't it? The Logos comes into our flesh and we killed him. That, by the way, tells you something. Whenever we're tempted to say, I'm okay and you're okay, we hold up the cross to say, no, we're not. Oh, we're basically fine. No, we are not. The author of life came and we killed him. How did Jesus deal with the enemies of Israel? Oh, if only he were a Davidic king, he would have fought them to the death. Rather, on that terrible instrument of torture, he allowed all the dysfunction of the world to come at him. Think of those passion narratives we read at Easter time, right? During the Holy Week. Stupidity, hatred, cruelty, violence, injustice, betrayal, denial. See, it's as though every form of human dysfunction came at him. How did he fight it? Not with the weapons of the world, but rather allowed it to wash over him. And then he swallowed it up in the ever greater divine mercy. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. See how that word from the cross is the moment when the battle is won. When the Mashiach, the Anointed One, dealt with the enemies of Israel. And then he reigns as Lord of the nations. How beautiful that Pilate put on that cross a sign, right? Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And lest anybody miss it, he put it in Greek too and Hebrew. Pilate becoming thereby the first evangelist, announcing the kingship of Jesus to all the nations. How does he know Jesus is the king? Because God raised him from the dead. Not a myth, not a symbol, not a literary device. But Jesus, in his bodily resurrection from the dead, shows what? What? That God's love is greater than anything that is in the world. See, why can Paul say, I'm certain that neither death nor life, neither angels nor principalities, neither height nor depth, or any other creature could ever separate us from the love of God? Paul knows it because we killed God. And yet God returned in forgiving love, swallowing up thereby the dysfunction of the world. And that's why the same Paul could say, as he careened around the world that he knew, Jesus Kyrios. Jesus Kyrios. See, but we say, yeah, Jesus is the Lord, this nice, pious, spiritual thing to say. But see, those are fighting words in Paul's time. Because what people said to each other in the Roman world was, Kaiser Kyrios. Caesar's the Lord. You see what Paul's doing, how provocative he was. No, not Kaiser Kyrios, Jesus Kyrios. Jesus is the Lord. Meaning he's the king to whom final allegiance is due. Do you see why Paul spent a lot of time in jail? See, because they knew exactly what he was saying and how subversive it was and still is. See, what's our myth? Again, from ancient times to now. Order comes through violence. That's what the cross meant. That's the old myth. You cross us, pun intended, we'll do that to you. We'll restore order through violence. God's love is greater than anything that's in the world. God's love, nonviolent love, is the means by which order is restored. That's how the temple is cleansed. We see the cross as an altar where a sacrifice is made. That's where the tribes are gathered. When the Son of Man is lifted up, he means the cross, I will draw all people to myself. You see how the messiahship of Jesus is what the first Christians proclaimed. It's what we still proclaim to this day. It's a decisive element of this great icon by which we read the whole world. Okay, let me bring it to a close right there with those four dimensions. And I hope what you see is the coming together of the highest, most abstract kind of metaphysical reflection in our tradition. But it's conditioned by this first century Jew, this Jesus of Nazareth, who died on that terrible Roman cross, but whom God raised from the dead. It's from that perspective that the whole Christian view of life emerges. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Well, thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Word on Fire show. Remember, you can find a virtual smorgasbord of related materials at our website, wordonfireshow.com. I hope you enjoyed this two-part talk as much as I did, and I encourage you to maybe listen to it again and write down any questions that you have. Then take those questions over to askbishopbarron.com, where you can record them easily from any device and have Bishop answer them right here on our show. Speaking of which, Bishop Barron will be back next week for a brand new episode with our great host and content director, Brandon Vogt. We always look forward to having you join us for great conversation and insightful Catholic commentary right here at the Word on Fire show.